Me.
Me and then Henrik. So just me and me first.
Good morning. My name's David Biette. I'm director of the Wilson Center's Canada Institute. It's my pleasure to welcome you here this morning, those of you who are here with us, those of you who are watching via the webcast, and those of you who will be watching at a later date. The Canada Institute is one of the 22 programs here at the Wilson Center, and we exist to increase knowledge and awareness about Canada and Canada-U.S. issues among policymakers and opinion leaders. And it's my pleasure this morning, or our pleasure, working with Jeff DeBelko and the Environmental Change and Security Program to present this program on changing climates in North American politics. This is, as you will find out, and I'm sure all of us will say, the culmination of a program we started, what was it, almost 2 years ago? A really neat thing looking at climate change issues in various aspects in North America, from municipal all the way up to others. So you're not here to talk to me, you weren't here to listen to these guys, and I'm going to turn it over very quickly to Jeff to say quick words of introduction, and then we'll get into the speakers. Thank you very much.
Terrific. Thank you, David. And they're not here to listen to me either, so I'll also try to be brief. I'm Jeff DeBelko. I direct our Environmental Change and Security Program. It's a great pleasure to work with David, Ken, and the colleagues in the Canada Institute. We are one of those other 22 programs here at the center trying to bring a range of topics in environment, development, health, population, and foreign policy and security policy together. And so today's discussion fits squarely within that. It's our great pleasure to welcome a couple of recidivists back to the Wilson Center. Stacy and Henrik have been longtime partners in both writing projects and in presenting their research here at the center. And as David alluded to, this particular book was one that we were pleased enough to be in on the takeoff as well as the landing here today, in that there was a series of meetings, and big one in particular, where some of the inputs to this book were first presented, first discussed, first debated, and hopefully improved in the process of having that discussion here at the center with some of you involved. I think all of you focusing and looking at climate change will understand that there's a little bit going on this issue at present. It's quite a bit easier to get into the Reagan building than it seems to be the Bella Center in Copenhagen these days. So we're pleased with that it's not quite so chaotic over here for today's discussion. But I think in part what distinguishes this book and this effort and really this frame is that it is not wholly obsessed with the global deal, but actually looks at different levels of political organization, how to deal with this, with North America as a regional frame, but going from very local up to that global level, but understanding that in many ways the history of getting things done on the environment, at least in the United States, starts local and is often the feds coming in to confirm it later on. Obviously, that's an oversimplification, but nevertheless, to me, it reinforces the importance of looking at the different political levels of analysis that changing climates in North American politics does. And so we're very pleased to have Stacy and Henrik, who've edited this book, to tell us about it today. You've picked up a bio sheet, so I'll keep that very short. But Henrik Selin is Assistant Professor, Director at Graduate Studies and Department of International Relations at Boston University. And Stacy is Associate Professor of Political Science, University of New Hampshire. Also finds plenty of ways to hang out in Boston as well, with a number of affiliations and time served at Harvard and Brown and area places as well. So I'm going to turn it over to Stacy and look forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much. There was a time, maybe a year ago or even a few months ago, where I was hoping and thinking it would be great to be in Copenhagen right now. And so I want to say that I'm actually really thankful to be in Washington with all of you. It's fantastic always to be at the Wilson Center, but it's particularly nice to be here and not and not in line for 9 hours at the Bella Center. Thanks so much to both programs for their support for this project. As they said, the book first came from a meeting we had here and a working paper we did, co-sponsored by the two projects here at the Wilson Center. They've been great. and it's been exciting work along the way, and we've been very happy with it. It also forced two international relations professors to dust off their early lessons of federalism, and so we had to burrow into our own institutions rather than being buried in the global ones all the time. Our view all along with this book project and some of this research on various levels of political activity in North America around climate change, our view has been that in many respects it doesn't matter what happens in Copenhagen for several points about American, Canadian, and Mexican climate policy. It turns out that in North America our emissions are much too high. We contribute substantially to the global problem. And whether or not there is a surprise and stunning breakthrough in Copenhagen, or whether or not they meet with no more progress than they've made to date, and they keep meeting, that actually matters very little for the reality that the climate is changing. The emissions in all three North American states are too high, and that the third observation is that it makes little sense for three countries who share a continent and an integrated economy to go about trying to persistently regulate a whole host of energy and climate change and environmental questions, and as well as to address some adaptation issues individually, that they should be working together. And that leads to the next notion that if they're going to work together, which is the subject of Henrik's part of the talk, we ought to learn more about what it is that's already being done on the continent and what are the lessons to be drawn from that. So there is the second plug for the book. It's the picture of the cover, as you see. We Americans are known globally for our ability to plug products, so I couldn't miss the opportunity. A couple of observations, right? One is that we live on a continent in a shared economy with three federal systems. These federal systems actually divide authority around environmental and natural resource and energy questions quite differently. But in all three, climate change has really forced greater contestation around those issues between the levels of government. So we see my colleagues in American politics call this the sort of dynamic nature of federalism, which I think is such a nice phrase for we're arguing about where the authority should lie all the time. The book project was organized around 4 questions, and I'll just briefly mention them and talk a little bit about a couple of them. Some of them rather descriptive, and then some of them more analytical. One is that we wanted to kind of catalog what are the new and emerging institutions and sort of policy forms around the continent. Developing in all 3 states, in the private sector, in the public sector, from the municipal level to the state and provincial level, and to groups of states and provinces. So we were trying to catalog also the second question, what roles are being played by different actors in this very dynamic and multi-level system. Thirdly, then, we were really interested in the analytical question of through what sort of pathways do subnational policy activities, that is, the things that cities and states and provinces are doing around climate and energy, through what pathways do those influence federal policymaking in all 3 states or in some of the 3 states, and through what pathways do they influence sort of broader policy streams besides the local or state level context. And so then, to what extent, the fourth question is, could we characterize North American climate governance as multi-level governance? And this phrase, multi-level governance, comes a lot from the European literature, because the Europeans who have, as I think most of us know, been more active at multiple levels of government on climate and energy issues related to climate change these last few years, that they have been struggling with this set of questions about multi-level governance of climate for some time. So the emerging institutions piece, I'll say just briefly that things that this audience probably already knows. For years, for many of the years, or most of the time since the Kyoto Protocol, the most active policymaking entities in all 3 federal states were not their federal governments. They were subnational units of various kinds, states and provinces and cities. The most significant institutional innovations around climate and energy have mostly come from states and municipalities. And so it's necessary to look at these and to look at their ambitious, the ambitious and the less ambitious ones, and to get a sense of what we're learning from them, how they're diffusing and spreading around the continent and elsewhere. I think it's useful to stop and and think a little bit about big sets of policy tools that that municipalities and states and provinces have used. And there are many categorizations of these. Any public policy textbook you open up probably has a different one. I have tended to use, or we have tended to use this kind of general one to talk about what we often call the traditional command and control regulations of emission sources or energy efficiency standards, these sorts of things, enacting taxes and various kinds of material incentives. The fourth is creating new markets and market-based instruments of various kinds, the cap and trade and other forms of property rights creation. And the fourth is using subsidies or manipulating subsidies, either subsidizing things that you want more of or reducing the subsidies to the things you want less of, but a set of these various policy streams. There is a fifth set that we could throw on here called the sort of voluntary instruments set. We didn't talk very much about voluntary instruments in the book, so they didn't make the slide. All of these sets, all of them, pieces of all of these sets are being used by states and municipalities around the country. And a kind of basic political science-y observation that I think most of you are familiar with is that when you enact these policies in states and municipalities, and when groups of states and municipalities work together, it turns out that policies develop constituencies. So one of the reasons we wanted to catalog where are all these different things happening and what's going on at these levels is because of the observation that people begin to then use them. And they either proselytize about them or promote them. They become materially interested in them, and businesses build up around them. So the role briefly of actors, I won't talk much about this, but we can if you have any questions, is that what we discovered is one of the best ways to understand how all of these policy innovations and policy models are spreading around the continent relatively rapidly in the last 5, 6, 8 years, is through professional networks, activist and professional networks. People move information to and from each other. They build networking meetings. They build networking connections, and they attempt to move through various sets of social interactions their policies. As some examples on that, sort of to put meat on that, things that some of you are familiar with. We have the New England Governors Conference and the Eastern Canadian Premiers. We have ICLEI, the group of cities who join the Council on Environmental Initiatives. We have the Conference of Mayors, the very active mayors groups, Canadian municipalities, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, and the Climate Registry, this group of states led by, or in a way underwritten by, California to build a standard reporting system. And when you get sort of to graphically display some of these, here is a map. The one on the left with the multiple colors is from the people at the Pew Climate Center who've been cataloging various kinds of climate activities among the state. And those are the regional groupings, groups that are active. And then there's little Florida down there all by itself in purple. And one of the things interesting about Florida is that on the one hand, they have a state discussion about whether or not to do a state-level cap and trade. And on the other hand, Florida has been in discussions with the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative with the states in the Northeast about joining RGGI. Those discussions are sort of on hold right now, in part because the governor is running for the Senate, and in part because they're waiting on Washington to see how those things come out. But you see the regional groupings of activity. The second one is the map of the Climate Registry, and I really like this map of the Climate Registry because it gives you a sense of how North American, a graphic sense of how North American rather than just American, some of these networks are becoming. So that you've got all the Canadian provinces that have joined the Climate Registry to develop this standard set of reporting tools for firms and others, and you've got all the border states in Mexico who've joined as well. I would also say the last thing about the Climate Registry, I guess I should say, is that the Climate Registry also responds to North American reality. So that the Canadian provinces and the Mexican states who joined many of them have been very active and engaged, but everybody knows the system has to work for the American system, so that this is part of the reason that the kind of California, Washington, Northeast, and New England, California, New England, and the Washington, D.C. folks have been very active together trying to figure out a system that might work continentally as well as nationally in the U.S. So the expansions of these regional efforts, you've got the New England one, the cap and trade system, which is up and running in the Northeast, the Western Climate Initiative, which continues apace to discuss possibilities of a regional group in the West. One of the things that's sort of a misnomer about them is that they're regionally based, the Western Climate Initiative and the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in the East. So we talk about them as regional initiatives, but actually both have been making it clear that they're open to participants wherever they want on the continent. So there's no reason that you can't join the market, and indeed they're talking about expanding them to non-contiguous units. Pathways of change. I'll say just briefly that we, through the book, we tried to tease out how is it that municipal action among leaders in the private sector, action among leaders at the state and provincial level, how is it that it influences other actors? And so we came to sort of look at 4 different ways or pathways of influence. The first is what we're calling the kind of strategic demonstration effects, or strategic using leaders using the lead by example principles to draw evidence out, to say, no, it's not. If your mayor says you can't do this, I can show you we can. We've got a report. Look how ours came down, and it didn't cost very much. And one of the things you find in the networks of state-level civil servants is that they call one another. Some of you probably are on the other end of those phones. They call one another sometimes, and they say things like, okay, I can't get my governor to sign off on this. What did you say to your governor to get him or her to do this, right? And, well, here we got this report, and we've got this data, and we use this, right? So there's a kind of networking and a strategic demonstration. Market expansion and creation from the cap-and-trade schemes, but also lots of green purchasing programs, lots of attempts to drive greener and more efficient products in the marketplace and expand those markets. Policy diffusion and learning. This was a kind of we use a kind of rational actor, that is the notion that actually if you think about all of these little policy attempts in politics as experiments, then people are learning from them. There's a lot of rational kind of analysis of them at professional conferences and by academics and think tanks, and you get a sort of building set of information. And then norm creation, that actually over the last few years you see that these are sort of becoming normal activities for state and municipalities to do. They're being institutionalized in state and local government, and indeed much more extent in levels of government. So we see this bottom-up pressure, these networked actors, driving their interests and their preferred policy models to the federal level, engaging things like the NAFTA networks as well, to talk about possibilities there, and throughout the regional networks. And of course, California is developing its own sort of policy, portfolio of policy responses. And one of the interesting things about California, of course, is not only is it big and important, and it has its special place in American law, but it actually has this enormous analytical capacity, so that the universities have really churned out a whole bunch of analysis for the state and of the state's activities. So you've got this kind of giant information generation. And then the status of multi-level governance. That what we found very strongly is that there is lots of multi-level governance going on, but it isn't coordinated very well. So you've got lots of governance at multiple levels, with lots of networked coordination, but because the strongest level of government, the federal centers, have been so reluctant, that these are not well coordinated. We talked briefly about 4 scenarios, and I'm just going to. So the book talks about this in terms of. That concludes by talking about what is the future for climate governance in North America. And we talk about 4 possible scenarios. And you see the axes are across the top there is how active, low or high, how active federal policymaking is in the 3 states. And then the vertical axis is how active is subnational, state and local and private sector governance. And so you get a nice matrix. We're political scientists, so we fall back onto a matrix every once in a while. And we focused primarily on the quadrant 4 there, the one we call complex multi-level coordination, where it seemed to be the case that even if this federal government, the one we're sitting in now, and the one in Ottawa in particular, get more serious about domestic climate change and energy policy than they have been to date, and enact some, that the chances are that fairly large areas of energy and climate policy will be left sort of unregulated by at the federal level, so that we expected there to be some areas where federal preemption or federal dominance sort of emerges, but actually there are quite a number of other areas where it is less likely to emerge, and therefore a kind of very complex multi-level system where on some fronts state or subnational power is preempted, but on many other fronts it is not, and we see some of the leader dynamics continue. I'm going to turn it over now to Henrik to talk a little bit about the lessons we drew for this, for what it means for continental cooperation.
All right, thank you. Thank you to David and Jeff as well for inviting me. Like Stacy, I'm very happy to have traveled from the hub of the universe to our nation's capital to talk a little bit about this. And what we've also been trying to do with this book is to try and be as sort of policy relevant as we possibly can. So as we know, people are meeting in Copenhagen, and there's lots of discussion about global climate change and what global framework should look like. And there's also a fairly large literature, some chapters in our book, chapters by Barry Rabe and so forth, that have been looking at what have U.S. states been doing, what has California been doing, what has Canadian provinces been doing. And the conclusion that we have sort of come to over time, Stacy and I, is that there's something missing here. And what is largely missing is the regional level. As in, if we are to move forward and think about both the global and the local, we also need to take the regional level much more seriously than we have so far in North America. And as Stacy also alluded to, there are definitely some parallels and lessons that can be drawn from Europe here, where within the European Union you have the most developed regional governance so far when it comes to climate change and energy. And we think that there are several lessons from Europe and several ideas from Europe that is applicable also to this continent. But then there is also, of course, differences. So whatever regional governance you might get in North America will, at least in some parts, be different from the one in Europe. So we're not calling for a just carbon copy of the European governance, but we do think that it would be beneficial to all three North American states or countries to think more about how can we address this regionally. Oh, it is. Oh, you'll switch it. There we go. So far, there haven't been much discussion about the regional level. Now, it should be noted that on the Canadian side of the border, there have been much more thinking around these issues than there have been in Washington. But so far there have been sort of, statements by president and premiers that we should work more together, but there haven't really been much more than statements like, wouldn't it be nice if we worked more together? And we are identifying at least 4 reasons for why it would be beneficial for all 3 countries to develop more regional climate change governance. And one has to do with policy learning, one has to do with economic efficiency, a third one has to do about meeting adaptation challenges, and the fourth one relates to leadership potentials, both within North America but also sort of globally. Now, we are not arguing that this is an exhaustive list, that we are covering all bases here, but we are arguing that these are 4 important issues, and I'm going to talk a little bit about them here, sort of building off what we're doing in the book. Now, one of the advantages of multilevel governance or federalism is that you get a fair amount of policy experimentation. As in, one state is doing one thing, another province is doing one thing, municipalities are trying different things, and some of these things are going to be fairly successful, and some of them are not going to be fairly successful. But what you do have when you have these sort of policy experimentation is that there is room for policy learning. And through organizations like the Climate Registry and other networks, I think it would be beneficial for public and private sector actors across North America to talk more about, so what have you tried in the past? Why did you do that? How did that work out? How might what Alberta is doing might be applicable to California? Or what are lessons from Texas for Ontario and those kinds of things, right? And what we've then also demonstrated in the book is that many of those organizations or forum where you can do this already exist. So this is not about starting from scratch, but more using those fora that are already out there to have more active dissemination of ideas and lessons and data across all 3 North American countries. Now, any of you who have taken sort of, basic economics, if you ever were in Economics 101, you know, and the free market people will tell you if you don't know, that basically the average cost per unit basically falls as the size of the market gets bigger and competition increases. And we already have a free market in North America, right? All 3 North American countries are already joined together under NAFTA. So when it comes to then developing climate markets, emission trading schemes, for instance, or when it comes time to develop market for cleaner products, CCS or whatever it might involve, doing that in a larger market where you have more competition as opposed to a smaller market with less competition makes economic sense. And in that sense, working through the forums that already are out there, such as NAFTA, it's going to help all three American countries to create these markets and basically try to drive down the mitigation costs that will occur if we're going to meet any sort of long-term goals for 2050 or 2060 or 2070 or whatever it is, right? You might get so far by energy savings, but there will be costs involved. And if you can then do that in an economically efficient way in large market with competition, then it better it is. So, for instance, a continent-wide carbon market is, all things being equal, better than 3 or more national or local carbon markets across North America. And if you have more collaboration among federal governments and states and municipalities, setting standards for renewable energy, because right now you have different definitions of renewable energy in different jurisdictions, that's generally going to help. And related to this, there's also a growing literature out there about sort of co-benefits of climate change action, focuses on other air pollution issues. As in, when you're taking action on reducing coal or clean coal, whatever that is, and so forth, you are basically cutting other kinds of pollutions too. So whenever you factor in what does it cost to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, you have to add the benefits of cutting other kinds of pollution. That includes mercury, particulate matter, SOx, NOx, and so forth, that come from many of the same sources. And many of these pollutants travel across national boundaries. As in, a lot of particulate that is being emitted in Canada affects air pollution standards in the US. And the ability of California and New Mexico and Arizona and Texas to meet their air quality standards in part depends on the amount of pollution that gets from Mexico. Right? So if we start thinking about climate change, energy, and other kinds of air pollutants at a regional level, that basically affords you to look at these issues on the sort of geographical level as is necessary, as opposed to just doing it at the local level. And quite frankly, doing it also as setting minimum standards across the continents also helps to prevent any risk of a race to the bottom, right? Within the NAFTA market. Because again, the NAFTA market is already there and it's probably not going to go anywhere anytime soon. So why not work with the NAFTA market as you're trying to figure out how can we address climate change and energy challenges? And so far that hasn't really been done. There will also be adaptation challenges. Now, some of these adaptation challenges might be more regional, but even the regional ones might cross national borders. So, for instance, northern Mexico and southern U.S. definitely share challenges when it comes to water issues and drought and agriculture and so forth. These issues do not stop as California hits the Mexican border. And similar things about forest issues, tourism issues, fishery issues across the U.S. and Canadian borders. So as countries start thinking what kind of adaptation challenges might we face over the next 10, 20, 30, or 40 years, it makes a lot of sense to have regional discussions around these issues as well and sort of develop collaborative responses where those are appropriate or where those are needed. And it's important here to realize, not least since Jeff's program is one of the sponsors, that we're talking about both national security and human security issues here, as we need to have a broad understanding of the security concept and think about how climate change and energy issues in a North American context are interlinked with those kinds of issues. And finally, it's always a little bit dicey to go to Washington and talk about soft power. It's always much better to go to Brussels and talk about soft power. But I do think that there is something to be said about sort of soft power and the power of setting regulation and standards that basically then become the de facto global standards. And the European Union have figured this one out, and it is one of the areas where the European Union is fairly successful, and they're doing their best to plug whatever they come up with at the regional level as clearly the next global standard. Now, the United States is, of course, a big country and has a lot of sway in the world. But there is reason to believe that sort of a North American approach to these kinds of things would afford each of the 3 North American countries, including the United States, to actually exercise more of an influence within global discussions on climate change and energy issues. And it is probably easier for all 3 NAFTA countries working together to meet competition challenges from the European Union and China and India in the future, right? Because there will be, or there is required to be, a lot of collaboration and cooperation around climate change, but there will also be a lot of economic competition in the future surrounding green technology, climate change mitigation, and so forth. And the more North America can act as one in the world, both sort of economically and politically, the better it is for all 3 North American countries, right? It can enhance the global leadership position of all 3 of them. And this is basically why we're arguing that continental governance is really the way forward also for North America. And by we're then meaning, we're really talking about sort of continental multi-level governance, as what the municipalities are doing is important, what Mexican and U.S. states are doing is important, what Canadian provinces are doing is important. It's not about saying that what's happening at the national or the subnational level is not important. That's very important. But what you need to add to that is more thinking about regional approaches, regional governance, what kind of regional forums make sense here. Should we use existing ones, or should we think about potentially creating new ones? Should we have regular meetings? Who should be involved at those meetings? And sort of how can we use those institutions that are already in place, including NAFTA, to build on to have a more coherent and more efficient North American approach to climate change and energy issues. And I think that's important both to meeting short-term goal, but potentially even more important to meeting any kind of long-term challenges that are faced sort of around the globe in sort of meeting the climate change challenge. And just to show that we are indeed in Washington, I'm just going to plug the book one more time.
Excellent.
There we go. So thank you very much.
Thanks.
And we're hoping that we can spend the rest of the time here to have a discussion around these issues. If you're thinking that what we're saying is complete nonsense, or if we actually made some sense up here.
Thank you very much, guys. Well, thank you, Stacy. Thank you, Henrik. We have, as one can see from the participants list, a diverse set of perspectives in the room, and kind of uniformly knowledgeable, but coming from different angles. So expect an interesting conversation. Questions come from all, so why don't we just jump in. Sir, if we could start here, and if you could let us know who you are, folks, when you ask your question, that'd be great.
My name is Joe Dukert. I'm an independent energy analyst, long dedicated to studying North America and energy and environmental problems. Far from nonsense. I think you should be congratulated very vociferously for what I think will be a great contribution. I hope somehow that your book can be brought to the specific attention of Todd Stern or somebody on his staff. I didn't look over the list here to see if anybody is here from the State Department. Yes? Somebody named Blake Thorkelson. I hope you make a note of that if it's
Please
possible.
identify yourself.
How
did he escape duty in Copenhagen? That would be the question. Yeah.
I do have a question. There is one municipality. It's non-contiguous, but it's extremely important climatically and has great political significance, and that's Distrito Federal, Mexico City and environs. And I wonder, I've been flipping through the book, I don't know whether you examined any activities along these lines in DF. But if you do, I wonder if you would describe them. And because, if we could bring he's not really the mayor, but the guy who runs Distrito Federal on board in a way that would recognize multi-level governance, I think it would be a great step forward.
You're going to give me that one, aren't you?
Well, I can start. Here, do you want to start? Go ahead. Okay. Well, there is one Mexico chapter in there, and there is one city chapter, and they both talk a little bit about Mexico City, but not as in depth as some of the other municipalities. Yes. No. I do. I do think you're absolutely right there. And isn't Mexico City part of the Clinton Cities Initiative? Yes. Yeah. So there are, again, that's another forum we haven't really talked about, but through the Clinton Foundation, they have a cities initiative, the large cities, and New York is in there and Mexico City is in there. So again, there's another connection. I think one way forward with Mexico City, and I'm not the first one to point this out, of course, is this whole notion about co-benefits. As in air quality standards in Mexico City are not great. So anything that links attempts to reduce other kind of pollutants with carbon dioxide and sort of capturing these co-benefits is really a good way of engaging Mexico even greater than has been Mexico City and Mexico as a country as a whole, actually, because Mexico City is that important. So if you do get Mexico City on board and sort of saying we want to do more about air pollution, which Mexico City has been working on for quite some time, but more clearly linking it to climate change, that would have an impact within Mexico, and it would have an impact also within the North American region.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that. The Mexico City has been the last few years a pretty dynamic place environmentally. It is discussed a bit here and there in the book. We did not have. We attempted to find a scholar who wanted to specifically do something on Mexico City, and we had some challenges there in terms of a book chapter. But I think we several times mention Mexico City also as an illustration, and the Clinton Initiative as one possible model, but there are certainly others, about why it is the case that, like units, whether they're giant megacities or sprawling suburbanized cities like this one, or Mexico City, why it is the case that actually around the continent, whether you're talking about ecological regions like the desert Southwest, or whether you're talking about megacities and large cities or transportation systems, that we share a whole set of challenges, and we are, as a people who share a continent, not really availing ourselves of those lessons. And we don't have institutions to drive investment into the right things either. So Mexico City needs serious infrastructural investment to turn some of its air quality and climate change trends around. And if we don't have institutions to do that, we also have some challenges.
Okay, go up the line, down at the end.
Good morning. My name is Duncan Wood. I'm actually from Mexico City myself, so I can help you out find authors for the second edition.
Perfect.
I'm also here at CSIS in Washington. My question is really about the problems of cooperation and coordination in North America. I think we'd all agree that it's a fantastic idea. And I've come from a 2-day conference in Mexico City talking about the problems of cooperation in North America. When President Calderon announced his Fondo Verde, his green fund, there was very little support from either Canada or the United States. And although Mexico is trying to be a leader in the developing world on climate change, it seems that it may be not a voice in the wilderness so much, but it's not getting a great deal of meaningful support. And the question arises as to whether real leadership needs to come from the United States of America in North America. And if that's the case, does it mean that Mexico and Canada need to adopt U.S. standards? Because there's obviously a great deal of resistance to that at many levels. Or is it the case that, as the Canadian government has shown in the past, that Canada and or Mexico need to sort of preempt the United States, anticipate United States preferences, and come up with a meaningful plan so that the United States can take it, modify it a little bit, but Canadian and Mexican preferences are taken into consideration? So I just wonder what your thoughts are on that.
I think it's really interesting. I mean, I suspect that many people would say the answer is both. In the sense that rich and more institutionalized North American cooperation can't happen without a much greater interest in it in Washington, right? At the same time, it certainly is the case that that Canada and Mexico, in my view, at least on the environment and energy areas where I know best, have not really availed themselves of opportunities to work together these many years since since NAFTA was finalized. But I would say this: I don't think we're not just because it's going out on the web, and I don't want 100,000 emails. We're not arguing for radical North American federation, right? There are various levels of types of cooperation. So if we think about, for example, a North American carbon market and allowances, that's going to take some new rules set down by the three federal systems, right? They're going to have to agree on some rules in order to make that work, right? Whereas when we start looking at the ways in which some state level U.S. states, some state level energy plans, some state level renewable energy standards may not be NAFTA compliant, where we may have a whole host of barriers to trade that are down, maybe hundreds of them, down in the policy weeds at various levels of government. These are things we have institutions for. We just need the three federal systems to get serious about some standardization and working groups and working together, so that where we can identify areas where clearly free trade in products that would be better for a greener and more efficient economy is where that is being inhibited, where we have standards that are in the way of those at various levels of government. We have institutions to study those, try to work on those, and marshal those through the governments in all three countries, right? So I think we do. So when you think about the various tasks at hand, we need various different levels of cooperation. For some of that kind of policy level of technocratic cooperation, we just need the three federal governments to set about people with amazing expertise who work in all three governments to doing it, right? Whereas, to say let's do that. Whereas for other things, we're going to need more serious sustained attention to build joint institutions. That doesn't quite answer your question. I mean, the challenge of the kind of getting into the policy weeds is persistently, right, whether or not Canada and Mexico are just expected to adjust. But I actually suspect when you get into the policy weeds that many of the barriers to trade are American. U.S., my years of Canadian sensitivity training have told me not to do that, to talk about myself as the American in a North American context. But I think we do have a whole bunch of those areas that actually could be addressed with the institutions we have.
Yes, I don't personally don't think you will get more sustained North American collaboration in various forums without much more active U.S. engagement. So in that sense, I do think that the United States is key. Two things related to that. I think more people in Washington should realize it's very much in the U.S. interest to do this, right? This is not the U.S. doing Canada and Mexico a favor by doing this. I think it would very, very much be in the U.S. interest to do this as well. Right now, with discussions going on in the Senate and the House, there is sort of quite naturally a sort of more inward perspective of what can we do nationally, right? But if you do pass something nationally in the U.S. At the federal level, I think Washington should realize that it's very much in the U.S. interest to work with the other two NAFTA trading partners and figuring out, okay, what makes sense to do at the regional level. That said, while there have been some discussions about this in Canada, I also have not seen Canada out front on these issues. So quite frankly, both Canada and Mexico could have pushed this more. So I do generally like the idea of sort of Canada and Mexico coming up into plan and then working with the United States and so forth. So the United States have been dragging its feet, but I also haven't seen any kind of Canadian and Mexican plan either, right? So I think all three North American countries need to pay more attention to these things. This is not just about America, but the United States dragging its feet. I think this is something that all all three countries need to do. And, for instance, a carbon market. If there's something we have learned in the US and globally over the last year, is that markets require oversight. And, for instance, you can do that within NAFTA. I mean, you could create a NAFTA kind of body or committee that oversees a continental-wide carbon market. So you need to add a new forum, you need to add a new institution, but you don't need to do like the Federal Union of the North Americas in order to do that.
I think that the last thing is that the cooperation problem would be bigger if some of the three states were massively more ambitious than the others, but actually none of them are terribly ambitious on climate change. I mean, let's be frank, right? So if they were really far apart and one of the three wanted to go really fast on emissions reductions and the other two did not, then you have some cooperation problems of the kind we see in Copenhagen. But actually all three states have frankly, currently less of a level of ambition about reducing emissions than the need requires. So it seems to me that the barriers to cooperation are not enormous on that front, in terms of their political positioning.
And I think there is another sort of one thing, another benefit of regional cooperation. And this might not be the smartest thing to say today and be on the web as having said it, but I'm going to say it anyway. Again, one of the lessons from the European Union is that if you build in regional commitments to meet regional goals, then when one member state goes rogue, you can sort of rein them in, as in you have the regional commitments, which then put pressure on when you have a new election and a new leader comes in. There's only so much he or she can do in terms of pushing the national interest because you have the regional commitments. And if you can then build those regional commitments in North America, you're basically buffering negative consequences of national elections. So if you do it regionally, that means you can build in things for the medium and the long-term goal and saying, as a region, this is where we are going.
It's the same logic of why we have a NAFTA in the first place,
right?
To institutionalize free trade.
Okay. Ma'am in the middle. Get you a microphone. I think coming from the other direction, right across the table.
There you go.
Mira Fickling from the Peterson Institute for International Economics. You just alluded to the fact that none of the three countries have extremely ambitious goals in terms of cap and trade. But my sense from meetings with Mexican academics is that they're not really looking at a real cap and trade system as the U.S. and Canada have proposed in the near term. They're looking more at national programs, or maybe using offset provisions in other countries to sort of get themselves on track. But despite putting forth a goal of 50% reductions by 2050, they're not looking at, say, reducing emissions 20% by 2020 through a cap and trade system in the near term. So given that sort of disparity between what Mexico is looking at and what the U.S. and Canada are looking at, how would you propose sort of implementing a North American carbon market given those differences?
I mean, in part, since you're from the Peterson Institute, I'll speak in terms of incentives, right? I mean, in part, it seems to me that Mexican officials, to the extent that I know, have talked to some of them, they know they're in a reactive position, right? So my sense is that if more regional cooperation on cap and trade was in the offing, they would be more interested in it. They've been down this road before, right? So that when the United States tossed the Kyoto Protocol in the trash, that dramatically reduced incentives for and interest in Mexican participation in the whole regime. They were expecting to participate in the CDM and in the JI in a big way with the United States, right? So if a system, if regional governance to reduce emissions were to drive even some incentives south to our southern neighbor, then it seems to me they would be more interested. And it seems to me there's huge Mexican emissions per capita, of course, are much lower than in the U.S. and Canada, but Mexico is a very inefficient user of carbon, so that there are huge energy efficiency gains to be had in Mexico, and incentives, it seems to me, that drove resources would help fix that problem. And I will say that again, when you descend into the weeds, it might be that that an agreement that allowed Mexican participation might start with only a limited number of facilities in a kind of trading scheme, right? I mean, you'd have to know for a trading scheme to work, you have to be able to verify the allowances. You know all this. You're from Peterson, and it seems to me that some standards about who and what kinds of facilities would participate would give incentives to those who can participate to join, and give incentives to those who couldn't participate to figure out how they can manage to get the institutions to participate. Is that an answer?
And even, I mean, within the European carbon market, so you have an overall regional goal, but the goals are very different for various countries, right? I mean, various countries have within the what's the name of the agreement?
What are we talking about?
The EU, different states. After the Kyoto Protocol.
Oh, the bubble agreement?
No, the sharing.
The burden sharing agreement.
Burden sharing agreement. Thank you very much. That's what I was going for,
You're
right?
European, after all.
Yes, I should know that. Within the European burden sharing agreement, different countries took on different kinds of targets. So just because you have a regional cooperation in North America doesn't mean that the Canadian and the US and the Mexico emission reduction target has to be the same. It doesn't mean that you need to have the same amount of installations and so forth. So all you need to agree on is sort of a general regional approach, but then you can divvy it up. So this is not about saying that all three countries need to have exactly the same standard, exactly the same goals, right? Again, playing with the economic efficiencies and so forth, you can very much diversify and have different goals at the national level.
Okay. Work that side of the room. Are there questions from over here? Oh, no. Okay. Paul, you have one, then David? Oh, no, we're working the left side of the room. I don't know what that's saying.
Thanks very much. It's a great presentation. Sounds like a fabulous book. Two questions come to mind. One is, as we've been talking about a regional initiative, the notion is that these municipal and sort of sub-state activities that you've talked about somehow have to bubble up into some kind of federal expression. And once that federal expression takes place, then we can have a regional kind of organization. I was wondering, though, can you talk a little bit about what if that doesn't happen? That is to say, what's the power of these still sub-state municipal activities? It seems like the book outlines these in detail. How can they have an articulation sort of globally? And if the United States doesn't get an agreement, I mean, if Congress doesn't come around on this, what is that going to, can these sub-state expressions signal anything to the international community of, I don't know, any kind of target? That's the first question. The second question is just more of a general question. You've talked about the importance and the promise of regional efforts. And I was wondering, I love this idea of continental governance. So I was wondering if there's any arguments against it. That is to say, are there any major drawbacks that we'd want to kind of slow down and say, hold on, there were a lot of environmentalists who were against NAFTA. A lot of environmentalists sort of don't like as you scale up. So can you talk about those in the context of your suggestions?
I'll jump in first. So on the bubble up question, I think that the current recession seems to have slowed municipal and state level climate policy making a bit. Didn't bring it to a complete halt, but it has slowed it down, it seems. If we see, the gradual recovery we expect, I would expect it to come back. The kind of institutional configurations and the frustration with the lack of federal policy has not changed on the ground in these areas. So I would expect some of it to continue apace. It seems to me, particularly the regional groupings of states in the cap and trade discussions, if Washington fails to do so, there's every reason for some of them to go forward, and I think that they will. There are some decent published estimates of the amount of emissions reductions that are being engendered by the renewable portfolio standards and the energy efficiency programs launched. So it's clearly the case, I think, that some of these policy instruments have already helped bend the American emissions curve on their own. part of what we were trying to express is that I think there's plenty of reason for them to keep going and plenty of expectation that many of them would, and that they can influence the general trajectory of emissions. It's hard to see, however, how without substantial federal role at some point the curve being substantially bent and then declining. And so that was the sort of the point at which we were looking at what goes on. Certainly the global connections have already been noticed. I mean, I haven't interviewed Mr. Stern myself since he's been in the last few weeks before Copenhagen. But we know a number of other country delegates and country people who are there, and the fact that California and a number of states have substantially more aggressive goals, and they're trying to seek to enact policies to reach them than the Obama administration is proposing in Copenhagen, is one of the problems for the for the Obama administration. Right? People do not believe that 17% by 2020 from 2005 levels is particularly impressive. And so those connections are already being made. People, when we first started doing some of this work 5 or 6 years ago, folks in the international outside the country hadn't really noticed all of the state activity. As California accelerated and their action hero made their policies globally famous. Certainly, there's huge knowledge now about a lot of this going on, and it influences international negotiating positions, I think. Arguments against. There are, I think, several arguments against greater North American cooperation that play well here inside this city, and they connect to the notion that North American policymaking would actually require some North American joint listening and policymaking, right? And so, to the extent to which people in this city don't want to do that, I think there are plenty of kind of sovereignty, autonomy arguments against it. I think another set of arguments against North American cooperation is will be similar arguments that we're having in the U.S. right now and on the Canadian side of the border to some extent about federal preemption. I mean, certainly the farther up the level of authority you move some decision making, the more some lower level entities, states and provinces, are going to have to curb their policymaking autonomy. So certainly, if, for example, we develop a North American goal and enact policies to reach it for how much renewable energy we should be using, percentage-wise on the continent, that would mean that some lower levels of government would be forced to do things they may not want to do. Right. So certainly there would be plenty of opponents in that on that front. I'll leave it there.
Okay. In general, agreement with what Stacy said. I think, though, we are fairly close to the breaking point of what U.S. states and some Canadian provinces are willing to do without more federal support. As in, they have done a fair amount of stuff over the last 10 years, and they have programming in place, and they hope to implement them and meet their renewable portfolio standards and so forth. But I don't see how the United States or Canada can meet any kind of really ambitious cuts for 2020, 2030, 2040 without much more federal involvement. I just don't see that happen. I think sort of the bottom-up subnational can make real differences, but it can only go so far. And I think my own take is that we are fairly close to the point now where the feds need to step in. Otherwise, I think there's a real risk that subnational efforts will basically level off. Not necessarily go down, but level off. So I think the discussions in the U.S. Congress right now are really important because I think that that will have a huge impact on what U.S. states will or will not do over the next 5 to 10 years, quite frankly. Continental governance drawbacks, sure. You can, like anything, you can do regional governance well and you can do it badly, right? So it depends very much on how you go about and how you structure it. For instance, working with NAFTA, potentially carbon markets, including Mexico, I can see private industry and firms in Canada and US, for instance, being in favor of that, in the sense that you can get fairly cheap greenhouse gas reductions in Mexico. So in terms of allowances and CDM credits, or however you want to structure it, then from their perspective, it makes sense to include Mexico if that actually helps to drive carbon prices down a little bit, at least initially. That would, of course, be the same reason for why environmental NGOs would not like it. So it depends on what you bring to the table here, what you envision. So any sort of arguments you can see about CDMs and offsets and what each country has the responsibility to do nationally and how much you can get in other countries, hot air, cheap reductions, and all those things, I think would play out in the North American context too, because if you start a North American carbon market or a cap and trade, initially reduction costs will be different in the three North American countries. They would not start from the same level.
David, you had a question? Don't come back.
This sort of picks up on the last question. And also, since we started this project a couple of years ago, the economy has changed considerably in the United States. Politics has changed a lot. There's more of an ambivalence towards trade and NAFTA. The dividing lines are increased. Could we sort of hop over the policy line? I mean, this all sort of makes sense in how we should work together and sort of look at the politics of it all, because I think with the ambivalence that a lot of people have towards NAFTA, not just old set of people, but new groups who would otherwise might be allies on this kind of stuff. Where are we? I mean, I think you talk about the Congress. I mean, that's sort of where the culmination of all this politics happens, and people want to get reelected. But this is going to cost a lot, and no one's in the mood to spend money now, and that sort of drives a lot of the politics around this. Yes, I can see what you just said, Henrik, about a lot of stuff staying at the municipal and local level, and then questions of federal preemption. When you're getting, the Canadian context too. I mean, is Canadian federalism? Can it exist in the current state that it is now with all the things that we need to do necessarily on a federal level? I mean, you've got Quebec polishing its halo and Alberta trying to stay clean, if you will. I mean, there's a lot of things going on there, and it all gets down to the politics of it all, which is sort of driving any solution or possible solution to this also. Can you kind of address some politics?
It's a good set of questions. I mean, the project assumes, and it may be an incorrect assumption, the project assumes that the federal governments can actually act eventually. And that may be an assumption that's wrong. I mean, when I watch my Congress in this town, right, over the last few months, it's not clear. It's possible that some of the critics of American democracy, and there are plenty of them in various quarters from right to left, who say, this government cannot address the problems of this country. And it may be that that's true. So the big macro question is that I think Henrik and I are in agreement about the importance of federal action eventually to bend this curve, and the feds on both sides of the long border may totally fail. And that I think we must identify it as a distinct possibility. Now, where are we on the politics? One of the things that is a cultural difference for those of us who don't live here in this city, I think, is that this is not going to cost a lot. I mean, for example, let's have a bold prediction, which political scientists aren't supposed to do. A 17% a cap and trade scheme, if it passes, with a 17% reduction by 2020, that will be a giantly over-allocated market. Every launch of a cap and trade scheme has been over-allocated because the goals are too modest, and because once you signal that emissions have to go down, they're over-allocated. The RGGI permits in the Northeast are worth about $1 now, and they are declining with each auction. Right? The goals are so modest, and we use energy and fossil fuels on this continent so inefficiently that it isn't going to cost a lot. It's getting over the notion that it's going to cost a lot. It seems to me that's the big problem, particularly here in this strange place. And that it seems to me is the president and his climate and energy team seem to me to be on some of the right messages in terms of connecting these issues to rebuilding the economy and rebuilding and altering our infrastructure. They're just only on message about 3 seconds a day on this because they spend the rest of the time on many other important things, right? So that I'm not sure. I think the message is right. It's just that it's buried most of the time in terms of some leadership on these questions. Now, I think that it connects to Paul's question about what happens if they fail. The feds may fail, and some of these things will continue apace for a while, and to argue again about these questions for another day. It's just that the problem gets worse each day that the federal government doesn't act on both sides of the border.
And I mean, Canadian federalism is, if not as messy, then definitely very messy, right? It's not just U.S. federalism that is messy. It's messy on the other side of the border too, right? And for the politics of this, I can see many provinces who would think that more continental governance is a good idea around energy and climate change mitigation. Quebec being one of them, Manitoba being another. Anything that sort of opens up the notion to more cross-border trade in renewable energy should find important constituencies also on the Canadian side of the border. Now then, Alberta might not be completely gung-ho about this, right? But again, this is a notion, it's the same thing there, that unless, this will not happen unless the Canadian federal government take on a more leadership role and a more firm role and saying this is where we as a country are going, and that involves all provinces, right? That there has to be a clearer message coming out of Ottawa. This is how we're actually going to cut our greenhouse gas emissions, right? And again, that doesn't mean that all provinces have to be treated the same way and so forth, but there needs to be a clearer message, both in Ottawa, in Washington. This is where we're going to be in 2020, 2030. Okay, how do we get there?
One of the things I've sometimes debated with Canadian scholars and friends is the subject of the Canadian chapter in the book is about the near total failed leadership in Ottawa. That's the subject of the chapter, as David knows. And one of the things that happens is that people frequently point out, activists, scholars, folks in the Canadian federal government, how limited the Canadian federal government is in its ability to enact these policies. And clearly institutionally it is limited on a number of fronts. But they always cite the last years as evidence. And there is no evidence in the last few years that the federal government of Canada has tried to enact national climate policy. I mean, there is no evidence from the last decade because no one tried in Ottawa. There's talking, there was report issuing, but there was no serious attempt whatsoever to alter the trajectory of the emissions, to alter national energy policy priorities. No attempt whatsoever. So until someone actually tries, then we won't know if they have the institutional capacity to do so. But so far, no one has attempted to do so.
And this will, of course, also be linked to global politics, right? As in, there won't be a legally binding agreement adopted this week, but there might be in 2010 or 2011, or even if it's not legally binding, sort of politically binding targets, Canada will have a target. And as you know, Canada does not look very good under the Kyoto Protocol. And the question is, does the federal Canadian government want to do that one more time?
Yeah.
Right? Probably not, because Canada has a reputation as a green state, and every time one wants to poke a hole in that, one says two words: climate change. Right? So if Canada really wants to uphold its reputation, long-standing as a good country, good collaborator, take on commitments, meets its goals, and so forth, it better get its acts together on climate change.
This is where Henrik and I do our usual thing when we come to the Wilson Center, hosted by David, by apologizing for our
trashing Canada,
for our ingracious analysis of Canadian climate policy, which is unfortunately becomes the theme each time. So again, apologies to the hosts.
We're always willing to go to Quebec or Manitoba. If they want us, we're willing to go there.
Exactly.
Can I ask a question about the role, if you have any optimism, or what's your take on the role of kind of external shocks to the system that might precipitate action? Clearly, whether it's true or not, the notion of the heat waves and the flooding in Europe were a big push to bring public acceptance and knowledge on the issue from the impact standpoint that arguably has pushed their leaders to be more forward-leaning and make this less of a political issue. Is there the prospect for that? I mean, do we need the Dust Bowl to break through some of these institutional logjams? And if so, is that something that is more kind of talk than reality in terms of making a sustained difference?
Yeah, I think there is some evidence that these kind of exogenous shocks offer opportunities. Someone has to take the opportunity, right? And so certainly if national leaders in any of the three countries avail themselves of opportunities, whether it's the weather or a political event or something, that's one thing. The challenge, as we know, on this side of town, more politicized comment comes, is that unlike most of Europe, in this city, which is governed by two political parties, one of them is opposed to reason and evidence on climate change. And so an exogenous shock will be when leaders in the other party decide that reasoned debate has prevailed on some of these questions. And that we await, of course. But I do think that, so let's have a concrete example. It certainly is the case, right, that the last president, his administration might have interpreted Katrina as a sign to come, as it was interpreted by many others around the world. Had the leadership of our country done so at that time, then we might have a different politics about what this means. So that was an opportunity probably for national framing that was missed by political leaders. But unfortunately, that one doesn't want to be in the
Please.
Yeah, you're right. I don't sit around wishing for another Katrina, right? I mean, as a political window of opportunity, particularly because in New England we're due for a hurricane, so we don't wish those things at all.
Well, I mean, we have chapters in the book that talks about sort of the importance of public demand and engaging the public. And all three North American countries are, thankfully, democracies. So on some basic level, elected officials respond to public demand. And this is not the only explanation, of course, but one of the explanations for why the European countries and the European Union have gone further than their North American counterparts is because of public demand for those kinds of things. Right? There is overall a greater public demand in Europe for more aggressive climate change policy than there is in North America. And what we're seeing in the United States over the last couple of years, that public demand and public support has actually gone down a little bit. So work by Bear Rabe and Chris Borick and others that do polling data are actually going down, that there are fewer Americans now than 2 years ago who say that they think climate change is a real problem, that it's human-induced, and we need to do something about it. And again, people in Congress and elsewhere respond to public opinion. And I don't know if there's any changes to the Canadian polling data. I don't know if anyone can tell us that. But again, if there was really, really strong Canadian support to do something aggressively, I think Canada would probably have done more than it has. So the problem is if there is not an external shock, but if there isn't a fundamental change in public opinion, you will not be able to have more sustained long-term climate change governance in the United States or North America.
Okay. Yes, back here.
This is Joe Dukert again. I'd like to make a political observation, personal opinion, and then recur to a discussion directly on the book. Mr. VanDeveer suggested, my eyebrows went up, that it won't cost much to achieve the 17% target. I assume you're talking about Waxman-Markey. And I agree with you, but then you went on to say that that really won't do very much because of all of the offsets. We keep pretending that serious efforts are not going to cost much, and we keep pretending that the actions that are being taken are going to bring an enormous upsurge in jobs, and I think both are totally unrealistic. Now, in my strong opinion, the place where we can really accomplish a lot is in building efficiency. But how do you do that? I think we've gone about as far as we can go in voluntary compliance with higher efficiency standards. We have to have higher building standards, but we're not going to have a national building standard. We're not going to have national building standards legislation. So I recur to the book and multi-level governance. What prospect do you see for municipalities and states defying the local interests that don't want higher building standards and actually doing something on a local or regional basis?
Yeah, here I think we have on this side of the border certainly we have federalist examples. You know, when the federal government wants the states to enact something like a speed limit or any other kinds of things, it structures incentives for them to do so. So if we had higher levels of authority with incentives for you for local levels, lower levels of authority to enact higher building standards, we would see them more generally enacted, I think. But Joe, I think we do disagree about some of this costs too much. And I didn't mean to suggest that I think Waxman-Markey won't cost too much. Reducing emissions by 17% won't cost very much. In fact, I think we have plenty of analysis that show it's cost positive. It's going to be positive for the economy. Waxman-Markey may cost a lot more than that because, of course, it's a giant congressional Christmas tree and gets worse with each committee meeting, right? So see earlier conversation about a federal government that may not actually work to address serious problems. But look, when I look at the per capita emissions figures of various states and the per capita emissions figures of Europeans versus North Americans, when there are hundreds of millions of people who live as well as Americans in the world at 50, 55, 60% fewer emissions per capita than we emit, we have to confess that we use energy really, really, really inefficiently, right? So no, I don't think the first steps. Of course we don't know how to get to 85% reductions by 2050, but it seems to me that there's mountains of evidence that getting started is not going to cost very much. That bending the curve and starting to change the economy in ways that assume that carbon must come down and that we must adapt to the changing climate, that's going to cost more, much more.
Okay. Can I ask one? Susie Moser, a friend of ours, and has a final chapter. Can you talk about some of the insights from her chapter in terms of communicating these issues that might get to some of that public opinion and support or lack of thereof, in terms of who and how and what message. So, for example, we've talked very little about the science today, as much as that has become a political football in terms of kind of false notions of certainty and what that is and what it isn't, and the scientific process and what it is. But at the same time, we have many friends and colleagues in this field who put all sorts of faith in, if the science says so, the policymakers will line up and come behind. And right. So somewhere in between political football and absolute kind of driving the process, there's a lot about how to do it and how not to do it. And so from kind of your insights and drawing on Susie's, where does that suggest we need to go to get to some of this regional governance? Yeah,
Susie's chapter, one of the, I think, general points about Susie's chapter is about talking in public forums and to large groups of in kind of the general public or specific audiences. She talks a couple of different points. One is that Susie, with using a lot of communication sort of theory and such, argues that we don't think correctly about the general public when we talk about climate change, because she argues very strongly that if we look at people who communicate for a living and study communications, nobody ever communicates with the general public because there's no such thing, right? So one of her lessons is about being audience specific, about knowing, about thinking more carefully about to what kinds of audiences you are speaking about climate risks and possibilities. The second is she argues pretty strongly that that after you achieve a basic level, that after many of your audiences understand some basic risks and some of the negative things that are possible in the future, that you should leave for communication strategies lots of the doomsaying and the pessimism behind. And talk more about opportunities as they connect to risks. So one way to think about this is a sort of positive framing and future framing. She talks a little bit about those, but in general, she notes that that large groups of people, different kinds of audiences in larger groups, tend to be disempowered by the constant focus of the kind of by the sort of scientific language of projecting, kind of using science to project catastrophe in the future. That's fairly disempowering, and it doesn't lead people to action. So even though many of us cognitively in our minds have that, well, if people are afraid of something or if they are worried about something, you explain this to them and they act. It turns out that actually a lot of research, she notes, on communication theory does not actually show that, bear that up, that messages need to be more empowering, more about action. One of the things I think the NGOs, environmental NGOs, as an example, concrete example of this, have gotten right in the U.S. in the last 8 or 10 years, especially the last 5, is that they have, many of state and local groups have taken climate change on as a concern, and rather than talking about big giant groups of scientists in places like Bali who are pronouncing on the doom of the future, they have focused more on what does a changing climate mean for us, for this place. So on my car, for example, because I'm a fan of this local framing, is a Save Our Syrup bumper sticker for New Hampshire, right? And there were several studies about how we'll no longer have a maple syrup industry, and that actually New England foliage won't look like the New England that we have in our minds if we continue apace. And so they've been trying to message these in similar ways. So if you live in a coastal environment, or you like your maple syrup to be not synthetic and terrible, but local and glorious, that these are ways to speak to people where they live and how they live. We have some maps at UNH as well that we use in public talks that catalog that the skiing industry is actually disappearing in New England. That you have to go. So if we go to the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and you can we have plots of all the little places where people used to ski, small little local ski resorts. One of the reasons that happened, not the only one, there's a development pressures and such, but one of the reasons that happened is that there isn't enough snow in many of those parts where those ski resorts used to be to ski anymore. People don't ski there because there's no snow. And so you can really try to pitch these, and that I think is very consistent with what Susie is trying to say, that most normal people don't think in terms of global groups of scientists and big conference rooms and giant reports, right? And so that was the sort of framing of where people are.
Yeah, speaking about the U.S. specifically, and I don't know about Canada and Mexico in this regard very well, but there is definitely a need to engage the public more. And I'm sort of, in the past I've used the word educate, but I'm a little bit hesitant to use the word educate because I don't mean coming and lecturing. It's not standing at the pulpit and telling people what people should think. That doesn't work. And what works even less is when you try to scare people to action, right? If you scare people, you might get them to act for a second, but any long-term action can't be based on fear. So rather than fear or lecturing or education, it's engaging people. And I think many people, not just in the United States, but all over the world, have a fairly vague or incorrect notion of what modern science actually is. As in many of us can probably not give a very good definition of what is it that a computer modeler does. What is a computer model? How does it relate to the global climate system? What is it that the climate scientists do on a daily basis? Right? How do they generate their information? How is it discussed? How does it get published? And that then goes beyond just climate science. I think there's a general problem of people not being all that interested in science and technology, and people not having a good understanding of how modern contemporary scientific work actually works, how it progresses. And then if you don't do that, then you have people saying so-and-so about climate science and so-and-so about climate science and so-and-so about climate sciences. And as an individual, you have really no way of making any kind of informed judgment by yourself. So you can have Fox News on there and you can have Rachel Maddow on there, and they're saying two completely different things. And if you're not if you can't make up your own mind, you don't know what to think.
Well, Paul, you have another question? Yeah, sure. Paul Wapner.
Yeah, I wanted to ask kind of an unfair question, which is you talk about, I mean, the book's about politics and so forth, and you talked about sort of educating or whatever people to do action. And I guess my question is action to what? And someone in an earlier question emphasized energy efficiency and the gains that can be gotten down that road. But really, I mean, we're talking about decarbonizing the economy. I mean, energy efficiency is the low-hanging fruit. It's energy waiting right there and so forth. So I guess my question is, and in terms of this conversation, it's all about, to a certain extent, caps. What's the target going to be for CO2 emissions? That's what they're discussing in Copenhagen and so forth. But I'd just like to hear your thoughts on sort of how does one go about decarbonizing the economy? And if we're talking about technological innovations, what in your minds, maybe through your work on the book or just more generally, what in your minds are the trajectories that we should be sort of racing toward, rather than just simply setting up a policy framework that says, okay, we're going to make this stuff really expensive and we're going to sort of force people to change, but we're not going to tell them how. If you could tell them how, what would you tell them?
Well, I'll give a general answer and then maybe the general answer is about educating people to do, and now I think the local and personal frames help us guide that, is that most of what I think, we talk about what should people do, what action should they take, mostly they should do what they do and figure out how to reduce carbon when they do that. It's a good generic example. So in other words, we don't currently have a construction industry particularly well trained for low carbon construction. We have only vague licensures in most states, and in some states, and most states have none for what it actually means to go on and get a person with a license to come and do an analysis of your house about all of those things. So when you start hitting people where they work and live, then you start thinking about what actions they can take. I mean, certainly on universities we're trying to shove in many universities now concern and activism about the environment from its normal places at the university over to places like engineering schools. And to getting our engineers to have, just getting them to have a 1-credit class on sort of sustainability and engineering has been, years of effort. But the idea is, of course, civil engineers need to be trained to be thinking about these things, not because they are going to be guiding the planet, right, in global cooperation, but because they're going to be engaged in engineering. So I think there are lots of ways to kind of connect these issues to where people are. Now, to you about the technologies. I'm less interested in the technologies, I'll confess. What I'm interested in more is the norm that every year in our country and our society we need to use less carbon. So that's why the cap is important. The cap is not important to me particularly because of its exact number or its exact point. The cap is the general point to the society that everything we do, we want to keep doing lots of the things we do, and our everyday activities have to use less carbon to do them, and and everyone has to be, related to that, right? So in my view, the 85% in 2050 will take care of itself if we would bend the curve and keep it pointed down on the emissions trajectory. And I hope that we don't know all the technologies that will help us get there, because we clearly need some more, right?
I agree that sort of decarbonized economy is the end goal here. You're not going to decarbonize the economy in the United States, in North America, or anywhere else unless you can convince people that that's a good idea. And then goes to what Stacy said, right? And I think that the federal government has a real role to do here about setting regulations and caps and so forth. But unless you can convince a clear majority of the population of any country that this is the right thing, right? We are doing it because it needs to be done. That's why we're doing all these regulations. That's why we're investing in a technology. This is what we're doing that. This is what we're doing that. Because there is a general consensus around the end goal that decarbonizing the economy is a positive thing and it's necessary. And I think it's fairly clear that we're not there in the United States right now. Right? If you were to poll the people, do you think we should decarbonize the economy? You're not going to get a large majority of people that say, yes, we should. And that is absolutely key. Right? We will not get there in 2050 or 2060 unless people, the majority of the people, think that that's the right way to go about it. So in that sense, people, but the federal government can then still play an active role here, and partly through incentives. Now, I'm originally from Sweden, and one of the things I've been talking about, sort of drawing a little bit from the Swedish lessons, is the whole notion about greening the tax code. Right? Is to use the tax code through penalties and subsidies to more aggressively support the kind of behavior you want to see, and trying to discourage the kind of behavior that you really don't think is going to help you get there in the end goal. My parents, who are in the late 70s, early 80s, a couple of years ago, got geothermal energy in their house. Because that's how they restructured the subsidies through the municipalities, and that's where the incentives were, and the old boiler went out and geothermal was installed, and from their perspective it was all about the economics. It was not about saving the planet for me or grandchildren or anything. Don't care about you, sir. It was all about the short-term economics. They say we can pay off the boiler in 8 years. That's a good idea. We can sell the house, make profit. That's the way to do it.
Yes. Sir, question?
My name is Kim Tufektis. I work for the federal government, more focused on adaptation than mitigation as an architect and facilities manager. But my question is, as a citizen, I wanted to say I really appreciate the discussion because you've made me think, and that's a good thing. And so I am thinking aloud here based on the discussion and the comment that came earlier about the focus on jobs, which has been a steady current in the discussion up until now, at least as I perceive it as a United States citizen. And it seems to me that the reason for that is that local actors all see an opportunity to increase jobs by being the niche that really makes a significant contribution in this respect. So any location will want to be the next technology corridor, Silicon Valley, for a new or a burgeoning industry of finding ways to solve these problems. It seems to me that one of the challenges that we're going to face as a continent is that when we all behave consistently, that the opportunity to talk about jobs, which was a concentration in a single area or a few areas, is a much harder case to make. And so I think that's perhaps why we hear a lot about it. And I wonder how other arguments that work locally, but that may be diluted when we talk about a whole continent strategy. Have you thought about these? And if you have, what learning is there to share back with us?
Well, you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, Joe is correct, of course, that, politicians, they have things to sell, and one of the things that they often claim are giant job gains for everything. At the University of New Hampshire, we pride ourselves. We say that we have one of the best. In the business school, I had nothing to do with it. They did one of the best analyses of a renewable portfolio standard, and they discovered there were several hundred jobs in New Hampshire to be gained, not the thousands of green utopian jobs that some were claiming at the time. So enough jobs not to shake a stick at, but not the kind of thing that's going to radically transform New Hampshire. It does seem to me, though, that if you think about the jobs argument as illustrative, that the jobs argument is trying to speak to people in terms of their current concerns. And I think that's why so that's one of the reasons it works in quotation marks, but sadly quite exaggerated. And here I think that one of the things in Henrik's part of the presentation is thinking in terms of North American competitiveness, thinking in terms of that this makes sense to people on the ground in all three countries, that this is a continent that's built a common market. Some of that common market is not overly popular, but nonetheless it exists. There's no giant movement to get us out of NAFTA, even though you poll people and they don't particularly like North American free trade. There are not any particularly powerful actors organizing around the idea of ending the free trade regime. And it seems to me that when you start thinking about continental competitiveness, when you start talking about the fact people know that Mexico and the southwest of the United States is warm, and there's sun there, and if you're going to start developing a solar industry, that's one place to start, where there's sun. They know that a lot of renewable energy and other kinds come from Canada over the border, certainly all across the north. Many Americans may not know that, but anyone who lives near the Canadian border knows that much of our energy comes from Canada. And so so when you speak to people, in terms of what they know and where they are, I think those things work. Without talking in giant terms about institutions for North American governance. That's the way political scientists talk to each other and the way we talk in rooms like this in Washington. But that's not the phrase you would expect people to use at the summit, right? And so I think that's about pitching, about connecting to people in where they live and work.
And also, sort of slightly related to what Joe also said, that there will be costs. I mean, if you accept or think that you should decarbonize the economy and you need to take adaptation measures along with it, some sectors are going to benefit and other sectors will not benefit, right? So whenever you have such a huge transition, there will be both job losses and job gains, right? So it's fairly clear that some sectors will benefit and new jobs will be made, like in New Hampshire and other places. But there's also no point in trying to pretend that no jobs will be lost. Jobs will be lost. And then it's a question, how do you deal with that? And again, to look at this sort of from both from a policy perspective and a market perspective, I think it's another reason for why we should think about this in a North American context rather than in the U.S. context or a Mexican context or a Canadian context. Because of NAFTA, any kind of measure that you take to restructuring the economy, any kind of measures you take to promote jobs in certain sectors will have ramifications throughout the market, right? You really need to think about this as what's the market we're talking about here? And the real market here is a trilateral market. It's not a domestic market.
Okay. Well, I think we've come to about the end of the time that we set for the session. Often we get good questions. We don't always get really good questions in some of these forums. So I appreciate the really thoughtful and insightful questions that brought out some, I think, very interesting responses from from Stacy and Henrik. So I thank you all for that. I would not be doing my duty if I didn't say the book is available outside for you to pick up now that you're convinced it has all sorts of terrific insights in it. We will do our best to get it to Todd Stern and Company in terms of taking this message out, or insights out. The video that Henrik and Stacy referred to is that the session is webcast live, something I should have told you ahead of time. But that video will be archived on the Canada Institute's website, ECSP's website, and one that we will urge you all to direct people to, as well as the book, but to that video and the various write-ups and PowerPoint slides and such that we'll have available on the Wilson Center website. So we urge you to take full advantage of that. Stacy and Henrik, thank you very much.
Thanks,
and please,
great.
folks, just join me in thanking.
Ooh. Oh my goodness, that's exciting.
It's warm here under the spotlights. Yeah. Yeah, that's fine. No problem.
So, Henrik, will you sign my copy after Stacy?
I can definitely do that. You're using a green pen. Oh, come on. Such an enviro.
The green pen, it's true, I didn't even think
I'm
about
going to
that.
use the green pen too,
Excellent.
therefore.
I like it.
All right.
Hi, I'm Stacy.